And
Right.
the first morning that I was there, they played a Celine Dion song, the Titanic one, like a melodic version. It was over and over again in the morning. And I was like, wow, okay, what's that all about?
Hello. So I'm with Carl Cameron Day, and I have to admit it's a little bit weird seeing you on a screen in a non-webinar context. So how are you today, Carl?
I'm okay, thank you very much. Yeah, not too bad here in Northern Ireland. A bit cold, but it's okay. I'm just so used nowadays just looking at myself on the screen. You know, that's every job. My last bit of work that I had face to face went online this week. So pretty much all my work is completely online. So it's just, I never really get to meet anyone apart from on this. So it's normal for me.
Excellent. So whereabouts in Northern Ireland are you based now?
I live just outside Belfast at a seaside town called Bangor. And here in Northern Ireland, I do... Actually, no, that's not true about my last piece of work. I do face-to-face work for the TEFL org weekend ones.
Thank you.
Just a few times a year, that is. But I work basically as an online teacher, which I've been doing for a number of years, and an online examiner as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And your story is fantastic. You've been to so many different places, and you've taught so many different kinds of people. So we're going to explore all that. So for the uninitiated, talk us through what you do in the webinars. They're so successful. Each time you garner lots of engagement. Has it been a satisfying experience for you? Yeah, definitely. It's my favourite
TEFL gig. I'm self-employed, so I call all my little jobs little gigs, really. And it's my favourite of all the little TEFL gigs I do, for sure. I enjoy just talking to people live, and I don't know what the questions are going to be. We try and change the topics up a bit. We did one last week on going away with a partner, which we hadn't done before. And yeah, we do get a lot of engagement from so many different countries around the world. That's the best thing. I love hearing where everybody's from when I say hello at the start. That really does lift your spirits a bit when you see everyone around the world and where they're from.
Mm-hmm. It's maybe a wee bit general, but what do you find people ask you about the most when it comes to the webinars and TEFL in general? Are there particular areas of TEFL where there's still huge misconceptions, you would say?
Definitely, we get a lot of questions on non-native speakers and whether they can teach, basically. And there is, unfortunately, still this sort of historical thinking that native speakers, and this is sort of generalized, you know, there's big chunks of the world where this isn't true, but there are, unfortunately, sort of thoughts out there that a native speaker can do a better job of teaching English than a non-native speaker, which has all been thrown out the window by people with PhDs and people who've written books. And we get a lot of questions about that. And it's just unfortunate, really, that it still exists. And the problem tends to be nowadays in 2023, not really the fact that people are sort of seen as different or better quality teachers depending on their L1. A lot of it actually comes nowadays from just, you can't go abroad and get work visas in some countries on certain passports. So, I mean, China is the big one. Obviously, lots of people, it's a big market to go teach in. But the Chinese government just limits the countries that can get a work visa. So it doesn't, and unfortunately, the countries they do allow tend to be the English-speaking countries. And, you know, it's really unfortunate. But it does add an extra layer of limitations on non-native speakers, and we get a lot of questions about that in the webinars.
Well, I mean, it's not hard to see why there are misconceptions when, you know, it's such a kind of varied thing, and we probably will speak more about that later in the podcast. But in terms of Carl Cameron Day, I want to take it right back to the start of your career. So you got a degree in language studies, and then you did a TEFL course, and then a CELTA. Is that the right order? And it sounds as though a career in teaching English was kind of always in the cards. So where did that emerge from, that interest?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me, it was always about travel, not about teaching. For me, it's always, and even as I say this, having lived in Northern Ireland for 7 years, I still dream all the time about traveling. And I think for most people, that's why they get into TEFL. So I was a travel agent, and I was booking lots of flights for people all around the world, lots of these amazing tours. After I'd been around the world sort of backpacking, and before that, and then I got the job as a travel agent, and I sort of realised that long term, yes, it's great getting quite cheap holidays, but I wanted to actually be living abroad. And I didn't have a degree at the time, and I looked into the best way of getting abroad quickly in something that seemed like it could be fun, and TEFL seemed to be the answer for that. But I did decide to do it by getting a degree. So I went and did a 3-year degree in English language teaching and language studies. I think it was a joint honours thing. And then after that, I went and when I actually didn't realise I'd have to do a CELTA after that, but I did actually end up doing a CELTA. And I didn't, sort of looking at it now, I didn't really even need to do a CELTA. I could have done like a 120-hour certificate. But the university where I was studying were really, really pushing me to go onto the CELTA, so I did. And yeah, from that, I travelled all the way from Swansea in South Wales, 30 miles up the road, to work in Cardiff, which wasn't what I had in mind. Love kept me in Wales for a bit. Yeah, so that was my first I had done summer school jobs. I'd run summer schools, I taught at summer schools, but my first real full-time teaching job, permanent teaching job, was in Cardiff in South Wales. Yeah.
I see. Right. Well, I've got to ask now, having studied both a CELTA and and being involved in TEFL courses now, and having studied a TEFL course, what are the key differences? Because a lot of people ask how the two certificates compare to each other, and a lot of people ask, like, do I need both? Is there one that takes precedent over the other? What's your perspective on that?
My perspective on it is you don't need to do a CELTA. If you want to teach English online or you want to teach English abroad, you don't need to have a CELTA. A CELTA costs more money than a TEFL or, for example, course. And we know there are other providers out there as well, but a CELTA costs a lot more money. It's a lot more difficult. I know on my course there was people that dropped out. I flirted with being a CELTA trainer for a while. I never actually did it all, but I viewed a couple of courses. I know people that dropped out of the CELTA. Can be quite intense. What I would say is that I think if you're going to make a career out of this, or you're going to do this long term, sort of for 5-6 years plus, I do think eventually it's a good idea to get a CELTA. I do think it opens up a few more doors, especially with companies such as the British Council. But if I could go back and speak to Carl, aged 23, 24, I would say to him, have a go at doing the 120-hour certificate before you even do your degree. Right. There wasn't as much internet around as I know. It's not decades ago, but there wasn't as much sort of social media. I started doing my degree before Facebook, I think, was sort of big. So I didn't have the knowledge that people have nowadays. There was no live webinars with a bloke in Northern Ireland answering questions. And I think that, if I could talk to 23-year-old Carl now, I'd say, go on, just go do your 120-hour certificate and see where that takes you. Not necessarily go and do the degree and do the CELTA.
That's an interesting point, because I ask every podcast contributor to tell me about the advice they wish they'd had, and we will get onto that specifically later on. But just while we're talking about it, has there been anything in the webinar that's come out of your mouth essentially, and you've been like, "Oh, I wish I knew that. I wish I knew that before." What good advice that would have been?
That's a really good question. I don't know if anything's actually come up in the webinars. The advice that I would sort of go back and talk to myself a bit about was I put a lot of pressure under myself at the start to be this amazing grammar teacher that knew how to teach all the different tenses, knew of all the different tenses. And I think I kind of felt like I had to be this know-it-all teacher. And I wish that I wish I hadn't put myself under that much pressure when I started, because you don't need to know all the grammar tenses. You don't need to know how to teach all the different tenses. What you need to learn is the one you're going to teach in that next lesson. And if you know that one piece of grammar, and grammar is such a small part of teaching, there's vocabulary, I think, is more important than grammar. But if you could just nail that one tense, and if you've got the confidence to say to students, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that one, if they do ask you a question about a passive tense you've never heard of, I think if you could, just make sure that you understand that one tense fine, and the rest will then come, and you'll build on it step by step in your first few terms of teaching.
Okay, so your first experience of teaching abroad was a 6-month spell in China. So where in China did you work? How did that job come about, and how scary was it adjusting to an entirely new culture, let alone starting a new career, even if it's a career that you'd put in a lot of planning and preparation for?
Yeah. So the university that I was studying in, they gave us me and another teacher, this great opportunity, which was basically just to travel to a few different places in China, sort of on a little rotation teaching. And the reason they gave us this fantastic first little teaching job was basically to try and get us to recruit students to come to this university, basically. So we would go there, we would do these ultra communicative lessons in a style that they might not have been used to. And we were like, okay, look, this is the sort of way you'd learn if you came to our university. Look how much fun it is, but you're actually in learning. And the idea as well would be to try and get the students to come to Wales basically and study, because that's obviously quite a lucrative market for a lot of universities in the UK to get foreign students out there. So I was right in the north of China, a bit down the middle, on the east coast, also down in the tropical south. I can remember on one trip I was in the frozen north, where it was sort of -20 and they had ice sculptures everywhere. And then I was also down in the south in Kunming, where it's quite tropical at times, So it was a really, really good first teaching opportunity that I had there. In terms of it being sort of a culture shock, I had actually been to China before. So when I was 21-ish, I traveled across China on the trains, and that was a great experience. This is way before I even thought about teaching. And so that was a big culture shock, that trip. I can remember being really, really in shock about some of the things that I saw and just the way different things were. But on that trip and that job, it wasn't too bad, the culture shock. The difference for me was just in how different educational systems worked. So I remember working at one university, and they had this big tower block, and all the students, it was basically their halls of residence, all the students would live in this tower block. And the first morning that I was there, they played a Celine Dion song, the Titanic one, like a melodic version. It was over and over again in the morning. And I was like, wow, okay, what's that all about? And then all of a sudden, all these students would come streaming out the front doors of this big tower block, and then they'd lock the doors behind it. And I was like, wow, that's strange. Coming from a British university where you're free to basically come and go to lessons as you want to go, or lectures, wake up whatever time you want to do. So I asked one of the teachers, I said, well, I've just got a question here about the Titanic song that I heard this morning. She said, oh yeah, lovely song, isn't it? And I was like, yeah, great song. Really enjoyed that song. Why did you play it in the mornings? She said, oh, just to make sure that everybody wakes up. I was like, oh, okay. And then can I ask, why did you lock the doors after they all left? And it's like, oh, because once you leave in the morning, you can't get back into your halls of residence. And it was like, to her, it was the most normal thing. But coming from a free British university, it was just so strange. Anyway, the next morning they played Happy Birthday. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. And I said, oh, why'd you play? She goes, oh, because there's like 1,000 people that live in that halls of residence. It's someone's birthday in there. And I was like, oh, okay. And then basically that just carried on. It was Titanic, Happy Birthday, Titanic, Happy Birthday, Titanic, Happy Birthday every morning. That was the first big shock I sort of got in just how different systems work, basically. Yeah. But a great experience, and I did love that trip. It was a really good one, yeah.
There's probably a joke to be made about certain songs and torture methods, but I'm not going to be the one to make it. But we're just going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Carl Cameron Day. He's going to tell us all about the incredible places that he's been to and what he learned from each experience.
Feeling inspired? Fancy trying something completely new? Well, make your best move yet by signing up for a TEFL course with the most highly accredited provider on the planet. Here at the TEFL org, we offer a range of online and classroom courses that you can study at your own pace. All of our courses include top-of-the-range teaching materials and come with dedicated tutor support from experienced and highly qualified TEFL experts. And what's more, we'll give you money off to do it. Just enter the code PODCAST at checkout to get 50% off any of our internationally recognised TEFL courses. And that includes our best-selling 120-hour Premier online course. With that code, you'll not only get 50% off, but you'll also get a free lesson plans pack. Within a matter of months, you could be a qualified TEFL teacher, out there exploring the world, or working to your own schedule from home as an online English teacher. Just use the code PODCAST at checkout to get started.
And we're back with Carl Cameron Day. So you went on from your teaching experience in China, or certainly your experience with the university in China, and then you forged your career as a teacher in some really popular TEFL destinations. So we've got Vietnam, Japan. What were those two countries? I'm being very general here when I ask this, but what were those two places like to teach in? What were your experiences? And were you predominantly working in schools or with language businesses? Like, how did that work?
So my first trip to Vietnam, actually my only trip to Vietnam. So, basically when I went to Vietnam, I got a job at Melbourne University that has a campus in Ho Chi Minh City.
Okay.
And they took me on and I stayed there for a year in Ho Chi Minh City. It was a great, fantastic place to work. It was quite westernized, the university, in terms of the way the system works. Okay. It was like an Australian syllabus. All the bosses were Australian. The Vietnamese, we did have a couple of Vietnamese teachers, but basically the Vietnamese staff tended to be the admin staff, the HR departments, payroll, things like this. I love Ho Chi Minh City. It's a brilliant, fun city. I was sort of in my mid-20s. It's very easy to get around. I had my own motorbike. I thought I was king of the world, driving around on a 1980s Russian motorbike left over from supposedly from the Vietnam War, but I don't think it quite was. And I got to travel to so many great places in Vietnam. Right into the north where it's kind of mountainous, down to the south where you got the islands. It's a great place and very different from Japan. But I'll probably talk a bit more Japan in a minute, but Vietnam is a really great place to go. And I worked with many people that have stayed and are still there, that stayed there a long time. And I could have quite happily stayed there a long time, except for when I was traveling a lot, I kind of had a rule that if I started to get too comfortable in a place, it was time to move on, just because I didn't get into TEFL just to stay in one place.
Sure.
Many people I know get into TEFL because they want to go live in Thailand or they want to go live in Vietnam, and that's perfectly fine. But that's not why I got into it. I got into it because I had this mad dream of ticking off as many countries as I could around the world, basically. And that's what led me to Japan from Vietnam, basically. Yeah, and very different there. In Japan, I went working with a university for one term. There's a company called Westgate, which I really, really recommend to anyone wanting to go to Japan. It's a really, really good way into Japan. So they got me over there. And then once I was there, I sort of realized that you can do pretty well as sort of a freelancer in Japan. So I sort of went a bit freelance. I did a bit of work for a university. I did some private students myself. I worked for the British Council there. And yeah, it takes a lot of admin tasks to get yourself going. You got to find your own flat, which can be difficult in Tokyo. Sort your own visa out and things like that. But freelancing in Japan was quite lucrative economically, and also just quite good fun, just to not have one boss that was in charge of you, to get around a bit.
Yeah, the point about freelancing actually is particularly interesting. So even for so many TEFL teachers either want to go to Japan or do end up going to Japan, and it's such a popular TEFL destination. But that's interesting because, you work freelance. How hard was it to build a client base? And what kind of different groups are we talking about when we talk about the kind of people that you taught?
A variety of people. So it wasn't easy to find individual clients, especially if you don't speak Japanese. So it tended to come from word of mouth a bit with me. So okay. I did this one term with Westgate, and they treated me pretty well, and they wanted me to stay on. But they kind of had this rule, Westgate, where once you finish your term, they sort of expect you to fly back to your own country and then come back. And I didn't want to do that at all. So I started working around I saw a job advertised for the British Council. So I went in there. They gave me part-time hours. I was on like a 0-hour contract. They didn't guarantee me any sort of hours at all, but I did a good job for them and worked hard, and they gave me more hours. But at the same time, I was sort of speaking to the students I had from the university and sort of saying, oh, look, well, I'm a freelance teacher now. If you know anyone that wants a teacher, and they tell their friends, and, it would come from that a bit. And then I saw a couple of universities that were advertising for just part-time hours. So I went and worked for them as well. I do remember having to juggle my schedule a lot. That comes quite difficult in Japan because some companies want you to work quite more early in the morning. Obviously, your freelance students probably have work or they have university, so they want to see you at specific times. Yeah. But it's a good way of getting around Tokyo, a good way of seeing different places as well. Whereas, if you're just working for one company, you can sort of just get stuck in the same place. Yeah.
That's definitely a great advert for making yourself known, getting out there, using word of mouth, and, for all the good, and there is a lot of good that can come from likes of LinkedIn and social media and that kind of thing. There's no, to my mind, there's no replacement for actually, showing face and kind of making these opportunities happen. So I think that's a really good advert for that. So cost of living and salaries are the kind of things that you've covered in webinars, and, I'd hate to make you repeat yourself, but, those are things that are really important to many of our listeners, and a lot of our listeners might not know about the webinars. So for people who are interested in working in either Vietnam or Japan, or, really anywhere you've taught in Asia, but we'll focus on them specifically, are teaching salaries enough for teachers to have these enriching kind of, these varied experiences while working? And what's the work-life balance like, especially, as you mentioned, in terms of freelancing?
Yeah, I think Japan is definitely, we get asked this a lot in the webinars about, as soon as Japan comes up, it's very expensive. People say, it's so expensive to live in Japan. And it can be quite expensive to live in Japan. But trust me, it can also be quite cheap to live in Japan. I always say you spend as much money as you want to spend. And it really does totally depend on you. I mean, in Japan, I didn't get to see as much of Japan as I wanted to. It's one of my regrets. There was a big earthquake, which did knock my plans out a bit. But even before that, I spent a lot of time just in Tokyo. And Japan is this beautiful, huge country with really good rail networks. It was kind of criminal looking back that I didn't get to see more of Japan, to be honest with you. But that's because I loved Tokyo, and I loved going to gigs, and I loved going to clubs, and I loved going to bars, and I loved eating in expensive sushi restaurants. And I didn't have, at the end of the term, I didn't have the money to go and have a look around Japan. But I'd had an amazing time in the 10-week term that I was on before. And, I could have spent less money. I actually came out of Japan having saved money, and I did manage to send money home as well at times to my British bank account. So I do think Japan is as expensive as you make it. I really do believe that. And if you are the sort of person like me who likes to go to gigs and likes to, go nightclub, well, probably not now, I'm 42, but if you're in your mid-20s and that's the sort of thing that you enjoy doing, then you're going to spend a lot of money. It's quite simple, really. Whereas if you that doesn't appeal to you at all. You're happy to cook your own food. You don't particularly like eating out. You just like to go for long walks around the city or just take trains out for the weekend to different places. It's a perfectly acceptable place. You have an amazing work-life balance. Mm-hmm. Japanese bosses do tend to work you. So I can remember I had the Westgate company I worked for, fantastic company. I do recommend working for them, but they expected you to sort of clock in the morning at 9 o'clock, and they expected you to sort of clock out in the evening. And that sort of things you don't have in a lot of other teaching jobs. You have a lot more freedom. They tended to want to know that you were there on site, and they wanted you to not leave early and that kind of thing. Uh-huh. So they do work you a bit hard, but it's a great experience, and I do recommend you go for it for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so while we're on the subject of obviously teaching abroad, that's kind of the name of the game here. It's another thing you talked about a lot on your webinars, about standing out from the crowd. And we're going to get into CVs and cover letters a bit later on. I think there's some really good advice that you've shared in webinars before that we could go over here. But what's a good way to stand out while working abroad as a teacher, in a sense of, making yourself available, standing out in terms of, in terms of quality, in terms of delivery? Like, what would be your advice for someone who's just struggling to kind of, make a name for themselves while they're teaching overseas, particularly if they're working freelance or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think if you're freelance, reliability is the most important thing for sure. Making sure that you're on time, you're well prepared, get those basics right, and everything else comes from it. There were times in Japan where I took on a bit too much work, and probably the lesson quality went down a bit. But definitely, I think the times when I was reliable and I was well planned, it was they really appreciate that, companies and individuals who take you on. I think when you first start teaching, you've basically just got to worry about the next lesson you teach. Mm-hmm. Get that planned and do that to the best of your ability, and then the rest of it will come from that. And you will get to a stage where you can sort of ask for some extra classes from a company that you work for. Maybe you want to teach exam classes, for example. Many of the classes that you teach when you first start tend to be young learners and general English classes. There are lots of different types of English teaching out there. And once you've done it for 2 terms, maybe you think, okay, right, maybe I'm going to take on a business English class. Or I'm going to take on a exam English class. And that will really sort of broaden your horizons a little bit in terms of teaching. It will also make you maybe find a niche that will allow you to be a bit more freelance if that's the route you want to go down. Lots of people don't want to go freelance, and that's perfectly fine. But definitely, I think just start, take it calmly, take it slowly, and then start to think about different types of classes as you have taught for a couple of terms, maybe.
Great. So we're going to look at some even more far-flung locations that Carl's been to, and he's going to tell us all about what it's like to teach somewhere where the infrastructure might not be quite as good.
Are you looking for a weekly guide to what's going on in the TEFL world? Do you want some advice on everything from job interviews to underrated TEFL destinations? Well, the TEFL.org blog has it all. Every single week, we tackle some of the biggest questions in the TEFL industry. Stay up to date with the latest trends in English teaching, find tips to make your next job application your best yet, or get inspired and read about the experiences of TEFL.org graduates teaching all around the world. Whether you're brand new to the industry, or you've seen it all, we can guarantee an interesting read each week. To find out more, go to tefl.org/blog. That's TEFL.org/blog.
And we're back with Carl. So you've worked in some, I don't want to say unusual, but maybe less heralded TEFL locations, specifically Sri Lanka, Kazakhstan, Iraq, we'll talk about Iraq individually because I think there's quite a lot to mine there. But what's the market like for English teaching in countries like that? And what were those experiences like, if you can sort of sum them up?
I think wherever you go in the world, there is a market for English teaching. I do believe that. I've seen a job advertised in North Korea. I do think that there are markets wherever you feel like going in the world, there's probably a TEFL job there. It might not be advertised, but if you do a bit of legwork and you do a bit of Googling and you contact language schools, you contact schools, universities, you'd be surprised how open people might be to employing you. Sri Lanka was an interesting one because they have quite a good level of English in Sri Lanka generally. Yeah. So it wasn't teaching sort of the low levels, but it was quite important to a lot of Sri Lankans in order to get a certificate to say that they could speak English. So I went and worked for the British Council, a really good organisation to get into eventually if that's the route you want to go down. And they took me on over there. Had a wide variety of classes there, and Sri Lanka I was based in Colombo. Lots of beaches though down to the south. Got out to them quite a lot. Really fantastic experience. Sort of easy to get around the country. It can be difficult in places, but I had a really, really good experience there. Sri Lanka at the moment does have real big financial problems, so that is another thing to be aware of. If you think, okay, do you know what? I'd love to go work in Sri Lanka. Okay, great. If their economy's having problems, there might not be the jobs there that you think that should be there. So that can be an issue. The other sort of place that I went that was a bit out there was Kazakhstan. Also, I've taught in Azerbaijan. Kazakhstan was a short-term contract. I really wish I'd stayed longer. I've had lots of Kazakh students in the UK they're probably my favourite group of students to teach in a way.
Right,
Kazakhs
okay.
are great fun. The men like a drink. They like to take you out. They're very hospitable. That kind of thing. That's so really good. Short-term contracts do exist. They tend to be quite hard to get, especially since COVID, because a lot of the short-term contracts have sort of gone online. But I do see jobs advertised in Kazakhstan, and I really do think it's a great place to go if you want to go a bit more off the beaten track. I think you'll be surprised. As long as you're okay with the cold, you will be absolutely fine and you'd really enjoy it. I'd recommend that one. Azerbaijan, again, was back with the British Council, a really, really small language school. It's not my favorite place I've ever traveled to in the world, Azerbaijan. Had some good experiences and some, kind of bad ones there as well, to be honest with you, but that's part of life. But again, I've seen jobs advertised there. If that's the sort of place that you feel, do you know what, I want to go somewhere where not many people have been to before, that's the sort of place you can go to. Yeah, but I do think Georgia, which is next to Azerbaijan, is much more fun. So I'd go to Georgia if I was going to go to anywhere in that region to live or work. Sure. But yeah, they were great. Wherever you go in the world, there will be a job.
Mm-hmm. That's just going off piece a wee bit here, but I actually, my auntie spent some time working in Azerbaijan, and would it be fair to say that are there sort of Western kind of expat communities there? Like, was the teaching kind of for international skills? Because I've got to imagine, because of the oil industry there, that there's a lot of kind of Western influence in some. There's a lot
of Scottish people there, Ewan.
It's what I was trying to say.
There's a lot of, yeah. There's because it's an oil company. It's an oil country. The country is all about oil, basically, and because of that, you get lots of people from around the world who have worked on oil rigs in Saudi Arabia, for example, Scotland, and probably the Gulf of New Mexico as well. That kind of place, that kind of region, and yeah. So there is a big expat community there. I must admit, I've got to say I didn't really hang around with them much. The friends that I was there with my wife, and the friends we made tended to be from Azerbaijan, and they, there were fantastic people there. There was, it's quite a well set up country. It's quite easy to live there. I I'm trying to be diplomatic here, but it wasn't perhaps the most fun place I've ever been to in my life. Yeah,
sure. You're allowed to have opinions about these things. It's not.
I've got some good Azeri friends. I don't want to offend them. You know.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. If in doubt, you can slag off where I'm from. So it's. I'm really joking. So Iraq's particularly interesting, and it's interesting in the same way that Vietnam is an interesting TEFL choice, because maybe this is a generalization on my part, but I would sometimes imagine that there might be not hostility as such, but maybe a bit of kind of tension in the sense that, Iraq and Vietnam are both places where there has been Western intervention, especially Iraq, and obviously in the last 20 years more so. But does that affect how English lessons come about? Or was there any sort of backlash to English teaching in Iraq, given the very recent history, or is that more maybe imagined? And really, people who want to do TEFL in these places absolutely can do, and there is demand for it. I didn't find that backlash in Vietnam or in Iraq. We probably do go into it a little bit. I can remember when I landed in Iraq, and one of the first conversations I had with taxi drivers. I'm always talking to taxi drivers, but where are you from? And I'd say UK, and he'd go, yes, Tony Blair, fantastic, Tony Blair. Right.
And I'd sort of come from a place where, at a time where Tony Blair was seen as a big enemy because of what he did in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
But the North, especially where I was, see him as a big hero. George Bush as well. Absolutely adore the two of them. And because they feel that they liberated the Kurdish North, which was basically where I was, feel that they got rid of Tony Blair, George Bush got rid of Saddam, fantastic, absolute heroes. And I'd have to be, I didn't want to get into a debate with them about the merits of Tony Blair, but, didn't feel that backlash at all. They absolutely loved it. Now, maybe in the Arab South, that could be slightly different. I don't know. It was too dangerous really for me to go there at that time. But where I was in the North, and also in Vietnam, there was no sort of backlash, against the sort of Americans. I know lots of Americans that lived and worked in Vietnam had no issues at all, So I think sometimes we sort of maybe think that our history is the way that the Western world sees maybe its history can be seen differently in other parts of the world. Yeah.
For sure. So obviously with this kind of range of different experiences, range of different audiences, I guess, groups of students, I have to ask you about your approaches as a teacher, because there's some things that maybe are universal and some things that aren't. So beyond lesson planning, and in a specific reference to some of these countries where there isn't as wide of a TEFL infrastructure, you could argue, beyond lesson planning, experience handling classes, other important fundamental teaching skills, what attributes do a teacher, so I'll try it again. So beyond lesson planning, experience handling classes, other important teaching skills, what attributes does a teacher need to be successful working in countries where there might not be as established an infrastructure for teaching English?
I think that everyone sort of has their own sort of strengths as a teacher. Mm-hmm. I still, when I've done observations of teachers, and I still think that the most important thing is to be smiley and happy and friendly. I do honestly believe that if you go from that, if you start that as your basis, everything else will flow well from that. When I do teacher training nowadays, and people stand up in front of me teaching a lesson, and they're not smiling and they're not friendly, I always say to myself as I'm watching them, that is the first thing that I need to fix as a trainer. I need to make sure that they look like they're enjoying it. They might not be, but if they've got to look like they're enjoying it, because everything then flows from that. It's difficult if you in a place like Iraq where people have got a lot of stuff going on in their lives that can be quite difficult. I can remember bombs going off at students' houses and they'd be in class the next day and stuff like that. And if you are there and you're miserable, that's a problem. Whereas if you're there and you're happy and you're smiling and you're saying, look, this is what we're going to do today, guys, come with me and we'll do this grammar, we'll do this skill, whatever it might be. I just think keep smiling your way through, even if inside you're struggling. It's almost like an escape sometimes, teaching from what's going on in your own life. And I think just that's what I always say. Now, probably other teacher trainers might think, well, no, you've got to get the fundamentals of a lesson plan correct. That's way more important. And they could be right. But for me personally, I just think be nice, be friendly, and everything else will come from that.
Mm-hmm. By the sounds of it, I've ever trained with you, to be perfectly honest. But so about these attributes, there's another one I have to ask, because, and I especially thought of this when you're talking about getting comfortable and getting too comfortable, and just the sort of curiosity you seem to have about the world. Do you think curiosity is one of the more important traits for a TEFL teacher, as well as all the fundamentals of grammar? In terms of personal attributes, how would you rank curiosity, if you could?
I think that it's important to be curious about your students. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when you're planning your lessons and you're worried about the grammar or the vocab you're going to teach, you can sometimes lose track of the people that are in that room with you or on the screen with you. And you've got to, I think it's important to do, for example, a needs analysis at the start of term to find out why they are doing it and to find out their motivation. So curiosity of the students, I believe, is really, really important. You don't need to know necessarily how many times they've been married and how old they are and how many kids they got, that kind of thing. But just being curious about maybe their jobs and why they're actually in that room for you can really help to increase your motivation as well to teach. Obviously, I think anybody that travels a lot around the world tends to be a bit curious. I tend to be quite nosy when I go traveling around the world. I like to go looking inside windows, and I get to go down streets that are a bit off the side and things like that. So I do think it's a natural sort of personality trait of people that do go abroad. But definitely, I think to be a good TEFL teacher, to be curious about why those people are there at that time in front of you really does help them and help you to deliver good classes.
Mm-hmm. It's just so interesting what's transferable, because when I did my journalism degree, one of the bits of advice I remember getting early was, be curious about the world and go out and live and do stuff, because that's going to make you better at writing. It's going to make you better at delivering a message. So it's really interesting how that that melds with, what's important about being a teacher.
It's funny because I actually know a few failed journalists that are TEFL teachers. I know a few. I mean, when I was at university, I was the editor of the sports section of the newspaper. I kind of saw myself as a bit of a journalist, and I got no journalism background, but I just thought I'd be okay at it. I thought I'd be good at it, and actually, I do know a few. Maybe not even failed journalists, but like people who have just had enough of journalism and they've got into TEFL. It does seem to be a crossover there, I'd say. Yeah.
Certainly couldn't blame them. So let's talk about the webinars, because I have to. And honestly, I could talk about your career at length, and hopefully we'll get to do another episode. But the webinars are so big that I can't not talk about them. So you speak from a place of real experience and knowledge. You've taught so many students, and crucially, you've taught students from the sort of TEFL program. So you're teaching students and you're teaching teachers. What I noticed though is watching you doing the webinars is you get a genuine buzz out of reading comments and interacting with people live. Would it be fair to say that's the kind of highlight for you, just the interaction and the voices?
Yeah, for sure. For anyone that is fortunate enough to not watch one of the webinars, I tend to start with a 10 to 20 minute PowerPoint presentation where I talk about a certain theme and I just get across my opinion. And then after that, we just let loose on the live questions. And I've got no idea what they are. We did sort of at the start, because it came about during COVID, these live webinars. We did at the start sort of get people to message them in beforehand so I could sort of plan, but now we don't do that at all. And as I'm talking like I am to you now, I try and at the same time read the questions that come in. Luckily, Alan, who works for TEFL.org, has we now get so many questions that he goes ahead of me and selects the best ones, basically, or the ones that haven't been asked for a while, that kind of thing. And I really, really, really love reading the questions, thinking about the answers, and letting loose. And I always say I'm not always 100% right. And I love it in the webinars when people disagree with me. I think that's fantastic because, that's just my, opinion. And, you've interviewed lots of people on this podcast who have taught around the world who might have a totally different opinion from me about things. And obviously that's perfectly fine. That's great. And I think what I like to say is that the webinars that we do is a sort of just a good start. Sometimes someone will ask me a question. I want to talk about it for an hour, but I can't just talk about that one question for an hour, obviously. They're a great way of interacting with people that maybe are just trying to get into TEFL. They're not quite sure. They're a bit on the fence of it. And it's given me such a great life that I just love it when people at the end of it go, great, that's given me the information I need. I can now go to do this. I've now got the confidence to go to Japan, because it really, really is a great life to go abroad with, but also not just if you want to teach online. I think that's perfectly, a fantastic thing to do that gets you talking to other people around the world. You might not want to go live in Japan. You might just want to talk to Japanese people. Fine. The webinars are really, really enjoyable for me. I hope they're enjoyable for the people that watch them, but they're definitely, it's a great hour that I have every Friday afternoon. Yeah, I love it.
Well, I mean, I don't want to speak for all the staff, but we do get excited about them on a Friday afternoon. There was one I particularly enjoyed, and I did reference kind of earlier. You're talking about CVs and cover letters, and I like it particularly because I kind of based an entire article around it. But you've been in a position where you're training TEFL teachers, but you've also been an employer, which I think gives you a unique perspective in this. So if you're hiring a TEFL teacher right now, what would you look for on their CV and on their cover letter?
Very first thing I look for is their qualification, basically, because I want to make sure that the qualification that they have is a good quality qualification. There are companies out there, and we're not going to name them, which do teacher training for $20, $30. Yeah. And they say, give us $30, sign into this website, do this little bit of work. Great. You're now a TEFL teacher. And when I was recruiting for companies, I'd have people that would do this. And I just used to think, do you want to take on a teacher that hasn't got a good quality qualification? Can you become a teacher within half a day's work? Absolutely not. Even if you go and do a master's, in TEFL, you're not going to come out of it as a perfect teacher. People are always learning, and you can't learn enough in a half-day cheap qualification, in my opinion, to be a TEFL teacher. So that is always the thing that I look at. Is it a company? Is the company that providing a certificate a good quality company? Are they accredited? And, if it was a company I didn't know, I'd Google them, and fantastic, they were a good company. So that's always what I look for. In terms of what to put on a CV, I think obviously once you've been teaching for a while, your CV sort of comes naturally. You can type what you've been doing over the last 2 terms, 3 terms, and that's your CV and your cover letter in a way. For newly qualified teachers, it can be really difficult to think, what can I put on my TEFL certificate? Sorry, my TEFL CV. And I always say, don't think that your past life is not at all linked to being in a classroom. Everybody has generally been to school. So first of all, you've got experience of learning a language in a school. What makes a good teacher, because I remember my French teacher was horrendous, absolutely terrible at school. And I tried to be the complete opposite of him. And if you've got experience of training people in a job, nothing to do with training them in grammar, but training them in how to work a till, how to use a computer system, something like that, that's teaching. If you've stood up in front of a group of people and you've done a presentation, that's public speaking. Teaching, an aspect of teaching is public speaking. So go and just have a proper think about anything in your past life. And it doesn't have to be work. It could be studies as well, where you have done any sort of teaching or you've done any sort of speaking out loud, because that tends to be something you can put on your CV. And recruiters know that if you did your TEFL certificate a month ago, they know you're not going to be this perfect teacher. They know that. A lot of recruiters don't actually want a perfect teacher. They want a newly qualified teacher that they can sort of mold into who they want for their company. And if you can see, well, do you know what? Actually, they don't know how to teach business English to Japanese people at intermediate level, but they know how to teach this. That's a transferable skill. That's public speaking is a transferable skill that can work just as well in the classroom as it can in a workplace.
Great. So do you think that's the biggest, or maybe the most common mistake that people make applying for TEFL jobs, is that they undervalue themselves, or they undervalue the experiences that they've had? And we've kind of gone over how to fix that, but would you say that's the most common thing, or are there other, mistakes that people sort of repeatedly make?
When I hear people go, "Oh, I've applied for 5, 6, 7 jobs and I've not had anything back," I worry about their application and I worry about their cover letter. Some companies want an application form, some companies want a CV, some companies want an application form and a CV. Every company is different. I remember recruiting, and it would be very, very obvious when someone has given you a generic cover letter or a generic CV that does not match the job that you're advertising. So if I would advertise a job saying you will be 100% teaching young learners, and I would look through the cover letter, I would look through the CV and not have a single mention of kids or children, that to me is an alarm bell. If you're going for a job teaching young learners, make sure you somehow talk about young learners when you're applying, basically. And I do think that that's the number one issue. And another issue that I do find a lot is badly written in terms of grammar and spelling letters and CVs. You can get away with that in some jobs. You can't get away with that in TEFL, because your job is to be able to teach grammar and to be able to maybe teach spelling, horrible lessons, but you might be doing a lesson on spelling. And if you are writing a CV that hasn't been grammar or spell checked, it's a big alarm bell. Yeah. And unfortunately, it does happen with TEFL teachers sometimes. You just can't do it in TEFL.
Normally, I ask guests about the piece of advice that they wish they'd been given and what advice they would give. But you're such a kind of special guest in the sense of that's a really big thing that you do for us already. So I'm not going to put you through that. But I will ask, what's the most surprising thing that's come up in your career?
Oh, surprising thing.
I've put you on a spot here.
In terms of actually being in the classroom, or just in terms of living abroad? Like
classroom, cultures.
Classroom. Let's go with classroom. Okay. Casual racism has come up a few times in classes.
It's never good.
Which I'm getting a bit awkward talking about this. That's the first thing that came to mind, is that just casual racism, which I've had to correct, and the mood in the classrooms of everyone in the classroom sort of agreeing with this casual racism, and just because they're not sort of open to the world as maybe we are, or they have different values, newspapers and things like that maybe aren't as free to talk about these kind of things. And that has come up a couple of times in a couple of places. So that has been something that I've had to deal with. And I didn't go down the, how dare you say that, blah, blah, blah route. I sort of went down the route of trying to educate people, and hopefully that works well. So that's definitely in the classroom has been the biggest, maybe not the biggest, but the most memorable thing that comes to mind when you ask me about surprising side of things. I mean, living abroad, really just the surprising sort of things that have come up have been, there's been the big things like, when I was in an earthquake in Japan, and how to deal with that is obviously a big situation that you face in your life. But I think really the admin tends to be something, opening bank accounts, sending money home, applying for visas. So, you know, I can remember Vietnam, I sent my degree certificate. The HR department asked for my degree certificate, and they took it off, and it came back about a week later, and somebody in a Vietnamese office somewhere had stamped it all with this horrible ink and had written all over my degree certificate. And obviously, you know, that's my degree certificate. I was furious, but just tends to be what happens, you know. And I think just in terms of the admin and the that sort of thing, the bureaucracy, that definitely surprised me a lot in lots of different places where I've worked. Yeah.
Carl, we're coming close to the end of our time together, but it's been fantastic talking to you. And I know, I mean, you're Mr. TEFL advice, certainly, you know, from my perspective. So it'd be great to have you on again at some point. But yeah, Carl, thanks so much for speaking to us. I hope you've had a good time.
Yeah, it's been great, Ewan. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah.
No problem. Okay, and
You've been listening to I Taught English Abroad, a podcast series by the TEFL Org. To keep up to date with every episode, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your streaming platform of choice. And we love feedback, so feel free to leave us a review on any platform you like. For more information about the TEFL Org, or about teaching English as a foreign language in general, head on over to tefl.org. That's TEFL.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.